Okay, a lot of you, your least favorite part of worship where you grew up, maybe with the church you were last in, is the prayer of confession. And we don't really do that one here. We tend to appreciate the assurance of grace as much. But we're going to have a confession. This is your chance to confess. Does anyone have any Christmas ornaments still up? Lights? Christmas? Anything? This first pew's in trouble. Y'all are, yeah. Okay, well, okay. Clearly, a lot of people love Christmas. A lot of you are very familiar with Advent. It's this church season that kind of leads up and prepares us to Christmas. You know about all the buildup and excitement. You know about the songs. You know about the decorations, the endless parties and planning, not just in church. I mean, we do a lot here, but in your regular life, it's just packed all for that whole month before Christmas. You know about the celebration, even if it's complicated by grief and sadness. Even if some of the Bible stories of Advent are kind of weird, and they're kind of weird, like John the Baptist, I mean, if he walked in the door right now, everyone would just be confused by that. Mary, think of her song. Every year we do her song. She's just taking rich people and just throwing them off their thrones, throwing them into the gutters. There's a lot of gloom and doom in these stories. But even so, you know that all of that season points itself toward a story of a baby Jesus, but more so the story of God's fullness coming into the world. And that is ultimately about hope and peace and joy and love coming into your life. So that's why, like, Advent's easy. But Lent, what is this season? If you're not even from a church like this, maybe you've never done anything for Lent. What is it, this season of 40-something days? Why is it 40-something days? Why are there so few? There's no Lent songs, really, until you get to Holy Week. There's no parties, except maybe an Easter egg hunt. No one puts a tomb on their lawn like we do with nativities. That'd be so weird if you just put, like, a tomb on your lawn. No one has extra Easter stress in your life the way it is in Christmas. I mean, maybe if you have kids and you demand to put little bow ties and silly hats on them, that's stressful. But other than that, it's not the same season. And the classic stories of Lent, they're even weirder, I think, than Christmas, because it starts on Wednesday is when Lent started. And on Wednesday, we got to remind you that you're going to die. It's a weird way to start a celebration. And then, like, almost at the end, Good Friday is all about Jesus' death. That's almost the bookends of this season. And in between, frankly, there's barely, if any, guide for how to navigate that kind of weight. And whether we're talking about the Bible stories or regular human life, it doesn't, like, flow the same. So a lot of people struggle with what to do with Lent, or they just don't care. They don't pay any attention until it's time to eat the Peeps and the chocolate junk. So today, we're going to start, and for the next several weeks leading up to Easter, we're going to start with what's the point of Lent, and why should it matter to any of us? And for that, I'm going to lean on Cole Arthur Riley. Cole Arthur Riley started writing poetic prayers after George Floyd's murder. She had no idea what to do with her feelings of rage and hope and transformation. So she created this it's kind of new style of prayer that only works on Instagram. It works best on Instagram. And so we became patrons of her art, and we started to adapt those prayers into our worship the last few years because they're beautiful and raw, and they come from a place I can't get to that place. And so then last year, after a few years since George Floyd, last year she wrote this book. Some of you read this here Flesh. It's kind of a memoir, but what 30-year-old writes a memoir? That just feels, I don't know what that is, but she's a 30-year-old woman. She's black, she's queer, she's disabled, she's a survivor of sex abuse, she struggles with depression. She's in no position of authority, religious or otherwise. Last year she wrote this book that I think is the best book I've ever read, This Here Flesh. It's just amazing if you're ready to dive into true heaviness of the soul. And then recently, just in time for Black History Month, she published a new collection of poems, prayers, and meditations for staying human. That's the subtitle, Poems, Prayers, and Meditations for Staying Human. And her book is called Black Liturgies. It looks like that. I started it last week as my Lenten devotional, and now I think that Cole Arthur Riley, she's all the way to 32 now, I think she's the greatest English writer living today. And I think when she gets to heaven, she's just going to slap Ernest Hemingway down a peg himself. So, Riley, she usually starts from this place of Christian sensibility, but she runs that through a lens of her own experience and from the wisdom of Black ancestors. And I don't know how, I do not understand how any one person, I don't care how much chaplaincy training you do, I don't understand how anyone can be so self-aware and so theologically attuned. And if you're ready to listen closely to the truth of the soul, you go get that book. But in her Lenten devotional this week, she said about this season, bookended almost by stories of death, she said, in Lent, we interrogate not only the systems of death around us, but also how those very tools of oppression and death survive in us. The point for her of Lent, she says, is to interrogate all the systems of death that are out there in the world that attack us, but also the ones that seep into our bones, that we sort of echo into the world. We get to focus on that interrogation and on rejecting those systems and then reprogramming who we are and what we trust around issues of death, but also around issues of just how to be alive, how to be most alive. So I think it's fair to say that process is not just about one biological sense of death, but it's the feeling of death if you've ever been depressed. It includes real death and the griefs that are close to our lives, but also the ones that we feel so helpless when we see the tragedies so far away that are there just based on greed and evil and hypocrisy. It includes the metaphorical death of joy when we just refuse to rest, or when we get caught up and accept the systems of capitalism and patriarchy. It includes the death of hope when we fall into despair about the future of the world or the integrity or the value of our own selves. It includes all the kinds of emotional deaths that suffocate our sense of relationship, our sense of beauty. And all of that for this season, where we are invited to interrogate. Why is the world this way? How have I taken that on? And ultimately in Lent, we are invited to move past that, to let go of these toxic patterns, and even to defeat or subvert these crippling feelings of death, and to practice new ways of being alive, new ways of embracing aliveness, and ultimately in Easter, to embrace new life itself. So this is week one, as we prepare ourselves to embrace humility over pride, solidarity over protection and security, surrender instead of power, dignity over self-defeat, courage and transformation over those easier roads of as it's always been. In the first story that you heard Mark read there, Jesus protests against the systems of death and oppression that are so vivid in Herod Antipas and so vivid in the history of the world with all the leaders and abusers and cruel narcissists who act like him. But just as much, Jesus protests the systems of death that survived in a regular old city like Jerusalem, namely the ways that regular people like you and I went along and go along with so much of the brokenness that surrounds them. In our story, he interrogates the evil and the banal, partly by demeaning it. When he calls Herod this little fox. I mean, you might be scared of foxes out in the woods, but compared to the lion that this man thinks he is, Jesus says, you're just a little yipping fox out there. Most power-hungry abusers and cruel narcissists really are just about like that. And Jesus challenges this one great symbol of death as he pushes back on those who have not resisted or broken free of that influence. And in so doing, Jesus, he always does this, he grabs onto a deeper logic of wholeness and healing and purpose and advocacy and ultimately sacrifice. And rather than facing power with power, Jesus exemplifies a controlled surrender as a way to protect the weak, like a mother hen. Isn't that a gentle symbol, a mother hen? Have you ever seen a mother hen fighting off a fox? Have you ever seen a mother anything fight off anything? That is full of rage. I mean, there's no rage like a protective mother's rage. So Jesus, while he offers us this feminine imagery, but it's also filled with strength. So that's Jesus. Now, this is me. If you've ever had a time to consider, wow, does Hanson have anything in common with Jesus? No. Let me tell you why in this. Over my years, where I have understood deeper and deeper, since my second memory I can hold on to is a little kid sitting in the back of a truck delivering Thanksgiving turkeys to poor folks in the deep woods of Arkansas. Like, I grew up in a town called Mountainburg with all of 315 people. It had a suburb called Chester, about 64 people, and it had a suburb called Chickenfoot that you will not find on any map. And we were delivering turkeys to Chickenfoot. And so my second earliest memory is about protecting and helping the people who need it the most. Now, I've understood the Christian posture to be protective of the least of these forever. And I think a lot of my work in resisting power has been to meet that power and stand in defiance and to demand rights for the vulnerable, which is good, amen? Yeah, if you can do that, that's good. But to be honest, if you take away the faithful excuses and dig into, how I grew up in Deep Woods, Arkansas, dig into my personality issues, and there is something about me, not faith, not Jesus, something about me that just feels the need to protect. When I grew up, so many parts of my life were so unsafe. Some of you know what that's like, where just all the things around you are unsafe. And so when you saw anyone who felt like a protector, you leaned into that. That became your image of how to create safety in the world. Even Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers. And when sometimes the protectors, even though they're the ones who put you in those places, you still follow toward them. You cleave to them, and you want to be like that. It's the only image you have of positivity. And probably because I have not worked through all of my stuff, none of you have worked through all of your stuff, but one of the main ways I know how to love is to try to protect. And so my wife, she travels all over the world, and when we were first dating, she would carry this dumb purse that wouldn't even zip up. It wouldn't even tie up. It was just an open purse. Anyone could reach in there and grab it. It drove me nuts. So I said, honey, I'm going to buy you a purse. Bad move. No, men, no. Yeah, no. It was, honey, would you like to get a new purse? And then she picks a great one out. But I couldn't. Or when some of my, my friends, they make these terrible relationship decisions. I've learned, you don't enter into that too forcefully to tell them anything, but you just worry about them. You want to help them in those places. Or I have one friend, he's a man, but he's not very powerful. He doesn't carry a lifetime of maleness. He never grew up with the male identity that some of us have, and so he enters these spaces without that sense of protection and safety. And so sometimes I want to make sure he's safe, which is good, maybe, until it's not. Worrying about people is good until it's not. Protection, even like a mother hen, sounds like Jesus until it refuses to recognize that someone else has their own real power that's theirs. See, so much of my commitment to standing up to the Herods of this life, whether they're on a ballot or whether they're in a bar. And when I started to grow up, let's say I was 5 or 6 years old, my dad was a professional bouncer. That's what I come from. And so he would bring me to the bar, and he'd stand me up on the cigarette machine. Remember the cigarette machines? And I would dance there on the cigarette machine, or I'd play pinball. And once in a while, I would see my dad protect the college student and the redneck that were drunk ones getting into a fight. And so I have a long history of seeing how it happens. And whoever is threatening, whether they're using words or laws or spit or abuse, whatever, so much of my commitment to standing up to power is about protecting those who are in danger, which is good, except when there's a better way. And Jesus is not always calling us from bad to good. Sometimes Jesus is calling us from good to better, sometimes from better to holy. So paying closer attention to our story, Jesus muses. He asks himself, maybe he asks them, he says, how often have I wanted to protect you, but you're not willing? Okay, how often have I wanted to do so, to take over your power, but you're not willing? And then, does Jesus protect them anyway? No. Does Jesus rush to their aid? No. Does Jesus remove their agency? No. I don't know if there's this sigh of resignation or if he understands deeper than I ever will how to respect their dignity. But he chooses to interrogate the tendency to provide help that is ultimately harmful, and he chooses instead to give room for his own trust and for their determination. So dignity becomes this foundation for aliveness for both of them. For both of them. In so many ways in our world chips away at dignity as a foundation for aliveness. We see a media drunk on criticism, our own tendencies to listen without generosity. We reduce people to their strengths or their weaknesses or their categories or their qualities, when true dignity is this complexity and context and nuance. I'm picking up an old project from when I was a physics major. You didn't see that coming. Physics major coming in here. After being a physics major, I went to, I did other things, and then I went to seminary and I studied philosophical cosmology there. And so when I think about spirituality and religion, when I try to think about it, I end up thinking about it kind of like a physicist does. Think, what are the building blocks of this universe? What are the building blocks of this thing, faith? And how do they work? How do they fit together? A physicist might be looking at quarks and bosons, and I'm looking at other things. How does it give substance to life? So just break it down for you, the basic questions of philosophy. If you slept through Philosophy 101, you're about to get the whole thing in 3 sentences. 1, why is there stuff? 2, how does stuff make things? 3, how is it that things have value at all? Okay, that was your whole philosophy. Whether your teacher knew it, whether you knew it, whether you slept through Descartes, all of it, that's what it's about. So imagine a physicist does that with things like dark matter. Dark matter is not a thing. Like at best we can call it a stuff. We don't know anything about it. It's mysterious. But how does that stuff come together with other stuff to make quarks and gluons and bosons and And how do those things fit together to make atoms and molecules and that? And how do those things fit together to make tables and chairs and human lives? Here's the big leap. How is it that a table can be a place of connection and it creates space for friendship? How can chairs be the kind of thing that creates relaxation and allows us to engage with the death and aliveness of the world? How is it that human lives convey beauty? It is amazing to me that we live in a world where we are both able to see beauty and beauty exists. I mean, what a connection that God has created in that. How does that happen? And if that's not spiritual enough for you, follow me down this similar journey. I call it quantum spirituality. There's never going to be another preacher who preaches on this. So this is a Hansen special, which means you can always throw it away and just focus on what Jesus said instead. So consider, spirit, that ain't a thing. It's a stuff. Spirit is a stuff. But somehow, attention to spirit reveals a foundation in things like dignity and grace and hope that when we need it, those are at the root of all being. Okay? And somehow, those things together, what are they tied together in if not love? If you saw that movie Interstellar, dumb space travel movie, but right near the end, there's this weird scene where he's floating around with big old lines that look like Tron. That is trying to express to you in some kind of movie that love is like a fifth dimension, just like space and time and all. Love is the way the world is fitting together in some way. And somehow love ties it together, and somehow aliveness is this order of being, an order of enrichment and blossoming of the latent qualities of being itself. Death is the opposite. Death is the pattern of exploitation and diminishing. Now, Tyler can correct me on any of the physics there because he's doing his PhD in cosmology. And if that story means nothing, Elizabeth back there, she teaches, I think, kindergartners, and they're the best people in the world at making hard things understandable. So talk to them to solve it, figure out what I said. But my point, I try to simplify. what if things like dignity and grace and hope, the values we lift up in times like Lent, what if they are not some special gifts to strive for, but what if they are features of existence itself? And what if Lent is this chance to embrace these patterns, to give them honor, and to remake them as part of the habits of your soul, or less aspirationally, more flow? How would your life be different? How would your life be more alive if you simply let go of the things that were in the way of a full life and paid attention to those things that expand and contribute to deeper love? That's what we're going to do for the next 6 weeks, one animal story at a time. The Fox and the Hen is just a little introduction into what life could be like if we move from fox to hen and from hen to trusting dignity. May it be so.